With that, first of all, my name is Mats Engman, and I work as a military expert at the Institute for Security and Development Policy in Stockholm, and I would like to welcome you all to this webinar on UNC and the role of Japan. And especially thank you, of course, to our 4 speakers joining us here today. When General MacArthur set up the very first UNC headquarters, he established this headquarters in Japan before being able to move the headquarters to South Korea in 1957. Ever since, there has been a UNC HQ element in Japan. But when we discuss developments on the Korean Peninsula and the role of the United Nations Command, we tend to forget and rarely talk about the UNC HQ element still in Japan, what is normally now referred to as the UNC Rear. But from a strategic and military aspect, Japan would play an important role in any contingency related to the Korean Peninsula, not only because of its geographic location, but also because of Japan's military capabilities and the strong US military presence in Japan. So in case of a contingency on the Korean Peninsula, possible military reinforcement and evacuation of civilians from South Korea would likely use Japanese territory and bases, both for transit and as a staging area. Such reinforcements would be coordinated by the UNC based in South Korea, and instrumental in this would be the UNC Rear HQ, now located at Yokota Airbase in Japan. To facilitate this, the government of Japan and several sending states of the UNC have signed status of forces agreements, which under certain conditions allow those nations access to 7 designated bases in Japan. The government of Japan has over the years reconfirmed its commitment to the role given to UNC, UNC Rear, and the sending states. To better understand this rather unique setup and to discuss strategic, political, and military implications for nations involved, we are honored today to have 4 eminent speakers joining us. Each speaker will give a 10-minute presentation, followed by a discussion among the speakers before we open up for questions from you, our audience. When asking questions, please use the Q&A function in bottom of the screen, and I encourage you already to ask questions and take the opportunity to learn more, and we will try our best to allow for as many questions as possible, but we may not have time to address all questions. I will introduce our 4 speakers in turn as they make their presentations. Up first is Group Captain Lyle Holt. Lyle is the current head of UNC Rear at Yokota Airbase in Japan. His Air Force background started as a F-111 strike and flight test navigator, and he has been involved in a multitude of Air Force as well as joint and interagency experiences covering naval aviation, air combat, air mobility, electronic warfare, and remotely piloted aircraft. Lyle also stood up Australia's first medium altitude, long endurance, remotely piloted aircraft unit number 5 flight to support Australian and coalition operations. And he has served as the staff officer to the Vice Chief of Australian Defence Forces. Lyle has also assisted in coordinating NATO military support to Afghanistan and planning and managing Australia's C-130 combat airlift and aeromedical operations. He holds a Master of Science degree from the Kingston University in Aerospace Technology. So please, Lyle, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Mats. Fellow speakers, webinar participants, thank you for this opportunity to participate and to speak today about the role of United Nations Command Rear. If I beg your indulgence for a second while I share my screen, I'll talk through a presentation. I think the graphics will help. They will say 1,000 words and help my 10 minutes. So I'm going to start today with a brief history that I'll keep relevant to UNC's role in Japan. Mats has given you a broad overview as well as the invitation to this webinar. So the Democratic People's Republic of Korea invaded the Republic of Korea on the 25th of June 1950. The United Nations responded swiftly with the Security Council passing several resolutions. At the time, it represented the world's first attempt at collective security under the UN system and remains a symbol of the international community's commitment to peace and security on the Korean Peninsula. Under UNSCR 84, the US established General Headquarters UNC in Tokyo in July of 1950 under the command of General Douglas MacArthur, as Matt's mentioned. Between 1950 and 1953, 22 countries, known as the United Nations Sending States, contributed either combat forces or medical units to support the Republic of Korea under the United Nations flag. On the 8th of September 1951, Japan and the United States signed the Treaty of Peace in San Francisco. Consequently, Japanese Prime Minister Yoshida and US Secretary of State Acheson exchanged notes wherein the government of Japan agreed to provide for continued support for UN forces deployed in Korea. On the 19th of February 1954, the government of Japan formalised those notes and agreed to support ongoing UN actions in and about Japan pursuant to UNSCRs 82, 83 and 84, when they signed the agreement regarding the status of United Nations forces in Japan. When Headquarters United Nations Command relocated from Japan to Korea on the 1st of July 1957, a small element remained in Tokyo to maintain the UN forces Japan SOFA. This unit became United Nations Command Rear and assumed management of the designated UNC installations and operations in Japan. Today, we maintain the basis of a coalition in Japan that demonstrates the international community's unbroken commitment, almost 72 years, to restore international peace and security in the area. Odd wording, but that's straight out of UNSCR 84. UNC Rear achieves that mission by managing and exercising the UN forces Japan SOFA. We have 9 UN sending states that are indicated on the map who are ceded to the UN forces Japan SOFA. Should they choose, those countries could operate in Japan under the SOFA from any of 7 designated UNC bases, 3 air bases, 3 naval bases, and 1 army base, using commercial and US DoD user pays arrangements for their support. Specifically, those designated UNC bases are Yokota Airbase in Tokyo, which is where I'm speaking to you tonight from, Yokosuka Naval Base in Tokyo, Camp Zama in Tokyo, Sasebo Naval Base, and in Okinawa, Kadena Air Base, White Beach Naval Facility, and Marine Corps Air Station for Tenma. Our mutually beneficial relationships with the Government of Japan, United States Forces Japan, 5th Air Force, Commander Naval Forces Japan, US Army Japan, and Marine Corps Installations Pacific, as well as with our 9 UN sending states, enable the readiness of UN forces in Japan to be maintained. The volume of United Nations forces operating in Japan has continued to increase since 2009. Last year, this international coalition to Japan comprised 3,944 personnel, which included 16 ships, 22 aircraft from our 9 nations across each of our 7 bases. These deployments provided a continuous presence of UN forces in Japan to help enforce United Nations Security Council resolutions, specifically against illicit DPRK maritime activities. I'll spend a little time now on United Nations Command Rear's structure. Reflecting back to my first slide, United Nations Command's mission is to enforce the Armistice Agreement, coordinate sending state contributions, and execute assigned functions directed by US national authorities through the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff to restore peace and security on the Korean Peninsula. My position represents Commander United Nations Command, currently General Paul LaCamera, here in Japan to maintain viable basing options for 9 UN sending states necessary for the defence of Korea. UN sending state liaison officers who are accredited from respective embassy defence staffs can supplement our staff of 5 to plan and directly manage their respective activities in Japan. As you can see from the wire diagram, we are a small international headquarters executing a very diverse mission. My final slide, I'll remind everyone that the UNC mission in Japan remains uninterrupted for almost 72 years. Orientating you to the top left photograph, this is Yokohama Commonwealth War Cemetery, where last year we honoured those UN forces who were wounded in Korea and died in Japan undergoing medical treatment. The top middle photograph shows an Australian Air Force C-17 that was recently arrived at Yokota Airbase in Tokyo. The C-17's cargo was an Australian Navy helicopter and about 30 maintenance, aircrew and other Australian personnel. The helicopter was disembarked, made serviceable and flew to Yokosuka Naval Base, where it embarked on the recently arrived Australian destroyer HMAS Brisbane. The majority of the Australian personnel joined the destroyer following a road movement across southwestern Tokyo. The C-17 departed Japan for Australia. HMAS Brisbane sailed from Japan to undertake Indo-PACOM's sanctions monitoring mission in the East China Sea and the seas around Japan. All activities in and about Japan were approved and executed under the UN Forces Japan SOFA, a practical demonstration of UN Forces operational readiness in Japan, demonstrating the SOFA's flexibility and utility. The top right photograph represents United Nations Command Rear's reliance on 5th Air Force, Command and Naval Forces Japan, US Army Japan and Marine Corps installations specific for space and support services. These steadfast partners remain critical to UN force readiness in Japan. The bottom left photograph is of Sasebo Naval Base, Kyushu. Our key partners provide outstanding support to United Nations Command, and we remain engaged with each of them in order to secure valuable space and resources across Japan. The photograph at the bottom right is of a recent video conference hosted in this office where I am right now between Japan's Ministry of Foreign Affairs, the US Embassy in Tokyo, Japan's Joint Staff, US Forces Japan personnel, and United Nations Command personnel in Pyeongtaek, Republic of Korea. It was a productive event that helped ensure that UN Forces Japan SOFA remains relevant and practical, but using it in a different way. United Nations Command intends to reinvigorate later this year an orientation program to its bases in Japan with a delegation of ROC Ministry of National Defence senior leaders during the period the 1st to the 3rd of June. The UNC orientation program can support efforts for a strong US-Japan ROC trilateral cooperation grounded in shared values and a desire for regional peace, stability and prosperity. We do that not necessarily as a SOFA function, but because of our positioning between US Forces Japan, the government of Japan, and of course, forces in Korea. The UNC orientation program will inform ROC military senior leaders to the purpose, capability, and footprint of United Nations Command resources in Japan. This tool will reinforce the strategic importance of international community capabilities, United Nations Command Rear, and as importantly, Japan in the defense of the Korean Peninsula and the stability of the region. That's all I have. That's the end of my presentation. And Mats, I'll hand back to you, please.
Thank you very much, Lyle, for giving us this kind of basic information that I think we all will benefit from, understanding the role and responsibilities and some of the formalities around the UNC and UNC Rear. I would now like to invite our next speaker, Lieutenant General retired Yamaguchi Noburo, who is currently professor at the International University of Japan. General Noburo graduated from the National Defense Academy already back in 1974, having held numerous positions during his military career. In 1999 to 2001, he was the senior defense attaché at the Japanese Embassy in the United States. He has been the vice president of the National Institute for Defense Studies and commanding general of the Ground Self-Defense Forces Research and Development Command. After retiring from active duty, he taught, among other things, at the National Defense Academy of Japan, and he has served at the Prime Minister's office as a special advisor to the Cabinet for Crisis Management. General Naburo holds a master's degree from the Fletcher School of Law and diplomacy at the Tufts University. His main area of expertise is military history and strategy, international security policy and strategy, and Japan-US alliance issues. And one of his most recent publications is Japan-India Security Cooperation on Pursuit of a Sound and Pragmatic Partnership. He has also written about geostrategy of the Belt and Road Initiative versus free and open Indo-Pacific and the role of Japan. So please, Noburo, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much, Mats, for your generous introduction of myself. Thank you for your introduction and my background. And I was firstly originally trained as an Army aviator, flying mainly helicopters, and I used to love flying Cobras, attack helicopter, in 1980s. And I spent 35 years in Army uniform. Before then, I spent 4 years in cadet uniform. After retirement from active duty, I spent 6 years at my alma mater as a civilian professor. And I counted it was going to be 45 years. So I decided it was enough. And now moved to International University, which is a private university, and the all graduate school. We don't have any the undergrad students. I enjoy teaching the foreign students. 90% of the students are foreign students. And it is, I'm enjoying teaching national security, international security issues and national security policy and strategy of Japan and those kinds of things. And during my active duty from 1983 to 85, I spent 2 years in Ministry of Foreign Affairs. I was seconded to the Mutual Security Treaty Division, and I was dealing with status of force agreement, both with the UN force and US forces Japan. And that time was for me the first time ever to learn how status of force agreement work. And at that time, actually, it was at the midst of Cold War. So basically, we were thinking of just Soviet Union. And the Korean Peninsula was not so much focused. So I personally didn't feel like the importance of UN or UN forces in Korea or what UN Command Rear was doing at the Camp Zara. But basically, we are dealing with sort of administrative issues or VIP visiting from the member states to Tokyo, and I was sometimes asked to make appointments with Japan Defense Agency and Ministry of Foreign Affairs, as well as Self-Defense Forces appointments with those organizations. So basically, what I was doing there for UN Rear Command was sort of logistics or administration. But after 1992, when the Korean Peninsula was facing to real sort of threat from North Korea, North Korean nuclear programs and the missile program became serious early 1990s. From that time, mainly with the United States, we had to work really hard to define Japan's role and what kinds of roles we need to share with Americans, as well as UN forces, the UN forces member states. And I can pick up maybe 5 areas. First one is the most important, the location. We can, as Mats and Group Captain Holt pointed out, 7 bases are provided for UN forces, member states. And those bases are really, really good bases. Kadena is one of the busiest Air Force base in the world. And Yokota is a very, very good logistic staging area. Futenma Marine Corps Air Station is 2. And if you look back the history of 1950s, 1950s, those bases and Japanese industrial bases have worked really effectively to support operations or operations on the peninsula or the movement from outside to South Korea, as Mats at the beginning mentioned. So the facilities, the location is first thing. Secondly, because of the discussion between US and Japan, Japanese government decided to establish a legal basis for Japan for implementation of Japan's law in case of regional contingency outside of Japan, mainly aimed at the Korean contingency during our discussion early 1990s. And then first one is logistic support, logistic base and staging area. We will be the area for staging the backyard for the front operation in North Korea, Korean Peninsula. That is the second point. Third point is actually more related to Japan's own defense. Our efforts for our own defense relates to support for the UN forces operating on the peninsula or the area surrounding the Korean Peninsula, such as our search and rescue capabilities or the information surveillance, the reconnaissance activities around Japan, and the other operational capability for Japan's own defense can be utilized by UN forces. That is the third part. The fourth part is more sustainability. And for instance, we discussed a lot about how many beds we can provide in case of Korean contingency around the Yokota Airbase or Camp Zama or other US forces, US bases in Japan. That is almost equal to the UN forces bases. So and also our industrial base can be utilized for sustainability for lasting operation in that area. So those kinds of things are what we actually newly established the legal basis for implementation during 1990s. And if you look at, I was one of the drafting member of the US-Japan the defense guidelines drafted in 1997, which dictates those kinds of the activities for Japan supporting activities for US forces. If it is for the Korean contingency, it equals to support for UN forces. And so now UN command, UN forces around on the Korean Peninsula and around Japan are much more visible than before, and the operation are much more important to implement UN resolution on many things against North Korea's missile and nuclear programs. For instance, oil embargo to North Korea, as Group Captain Holt has already mentioned. Not only US but also Australia, France, Canada, and other UK and other UN member states, UN command member states, operating area around Korean Peninsula for that purpose. And that is for Korean contingency. But if you look at a broader area of the free and open Indo-Pacific, Korean Peninsula and Japanese islands, main islands are located at the eastern corner of that area. The free and open Indo-Pacific begins or ends at the Japan and Korea. So again, it has a global context too. Perhaps I'll stop here.
Thank you very much, General, for sharing this long perspective of your service over the relations between Japan and United States and the UNC. We still have some problems, and I need to apologize for this, to get one of our speakers, General Jerry Martinez, on board. So hopefully he will be able to join us, but I would like now to turn to our fourth speaker, Professor Narushige Michishita, who is currently the Vice President at the National Graduate Institute for Policy Studies in Tokyo, and a board member of the National Security Secretariat Advisory Board, the Government of Japan. Michi holds a PhD in international relations from the Johns Hopkins University in the United States, and he has an extensive and very successful career, and among his many assignments are as a senior research fellow at the National Institute for Defense Studies at the Ministry of Defense of Japan, assistant counselor when it comes to national security and crisis management at the Cabinet Secretariat, and he's also a global fellow at the Woodrow Wilson International Center. His research interest is focused on strategic studies, Japanese defense and foreign policy, and security issues on the Korean Peninsula. Professor Michi has an extensive list of publications, and one of his most recent is on strategic implications of North Korea's enhanced nuclear and missile capabilities. So with this introduction, please, Michi, the floor is yours. Are you muted, Professor Michi?
Can you hear me?
Now I can hear you.
Okay, great. Thanks. Sorry about that. So thank you very much, Mats, for the kind introduction. I will talk about 4 things today. One is Japan's role in the defense of South Korea. 2, the roles of a United Nations command from the Japanese viewpoint. And 3 challenges that we face regarding these issues. And finally, some of the potential problems that we might face if we sign, or the United States and South Korea and North Korea sign a peace agreement. So first, let me start sharing some slides. So as you know, as we have already talked about, there are critical, important main operating bases in Japan. And Japan is serving as a rear base for the US forces operating, or which would operate for the defense of South Korea. And the Japanese self-defense force would provide protection for those bases. Oh, by the way, these are the how different bases, sorry for the Japanese material, but different bases in Japan will be used for Korea. And in order to protect those bases, Japan has spent more than $20 billion already in deploying 2 different ballistic missile defense systems. The second role that Japan is playing or will be playing in case of Korean contingencies is, as General Yamaguchi talked about, Japan will be providing support to the US forces fighting for the Korean contingency. For the purpose, in 1999, Japanese Diet Parliament enacted a law to deal with the situations in areas surrounding Japan, which made it possible for the Japanese armed forces to provide non-combat support to the US forces fighting for South Korea. In 2015, the Japanese parliament enacted yet another set of laws which made it possible for Japan to start exercising the right of collective self-defense, which made it possible for the Japanese self-defense forces to not only to provide non-combat support to the US forces, but also combat support to the US forces operating for the defense of South Korea. Let me talk about the second issue of the roles of a United Nations command from the Japanese perspective. At least there are 4 important roles that it plays. One is that in case of Korean contingencies, if non-US forces would like to operate on the Korean Peninsula and operating from the bases in Japan in support of South Korea, for example, Australia or the United Kingdom, they could use bases in Japan and for the operation for the Korean Peninsula. Second role is that the United Nations Command would function as a point of contact for non-combatant evacuation operations. As we are seeing in Ukraine, there will be a huge number of refugees coming out of the Korean Peninsula, and the most likely destination is Japan. And we have to do a good job of coordinating those operations. Third, in case now that the Japanese self-defense force can play or conduct combat operations, in case the self-defense force operates inside the Korean Theater of Operation or KTO, a United Nations Command might serve as a point of contact. For example, the United States might ask Japan to conduct mine sweeping operations prior to its amphibious landing operations on North Korea. Now there is a debate going on in Japan whether or not Japan should think about conducting strike operations against a target, especially missiles or missile bases inside North Korea in case of war. And if we are to do it, we have to coordinate very closely with the US and South Korea in terms of strike operations inside North Korea. And finally, United Nations Command serves or plays a non-Korea security roles in some cases. This is a sort of like exceptional cases, but during when the big earthquake hit Japan back in 2011, Australia sent C-17 transport aircraft to Japan to help provide support, and we are very grateful. How could they come to Japan? They used the United Nations SOFA or Japan UNC SOFA. So that served as a very important humanitarian role or a purpose back then. Let me talk about some problems or challenges that we face going forward. One is, as I talked about, United Nations Command might serve as a point of contact when Japanese forces operates inside the Korean theater of operations. How can we coordinate? You know, there is no combined command between Japan and the US or Japan and Korea. So possibly United Nations Command would at least technically serve as a point of contact, And Japanese forces will probably not be operating under the US ROK Combined Forces Command. And therefore, already commanders of Combined Forces Command and the Indo-PACOM are coordinating very closely in order to deal with Korean contingencies. But I think it's not enough, and we have to find a way to really coordinate US, ROK, and Japanese forces in case of Korean contingencies. And also, related to this is not really a UNC issue, but the US and Japan, US-Japan alliance and the US-ROK alliance have two separate operation plans for Korean contingencies, and we have to coordinate better. And also, North Korea has been developing medium-range ballistic missiles, intermediate-range ballistic missiles, and now intercontinental ballistic missiles. So not only CFC, but also PACOM, Indo-PACOM, and even Strategic Command might be coordinating much more closely going forward. And the second issue that we face is technically we have Japan UNC SOFA. So for non-US countries will be able to, or US will be able to use Japanese bases in war. But let's face it, we are looking at what we are seeing in Ukraine. Russia suggested the possible use of nuclear weapons. And all the NATO countries simply got freaked out, right? They are not intervening in this war. So North Korea would do the same against Japan, against the United States. And even with the existence of Japan UNC SOFA, North Korea might succeed in deterring the United States and Japan from providing support to South Korea in case of emergency. And finally, just two potential problems I think I kind of imagine which will come out if we decide to sign a peace agreement on the Korean Peninsula. One is, as some specialists talked about in the previous session, United Nations Command will likely disappear, right? And together with that, UNC Rear will disappear. And if that happens, the roles that I talked about, which UNC plays, will be gone, right? So that would be a major challenge. I mean, even with the existence of a United Nations Command, we have some problems. Without it, that would be a huge challenge that we face. Also, if we sign a peace agreement, legal sort of basis, foundation on which we operate, on all the countries operate, would be based on peacetime international law. That means, let me just show you. So there is currently a line called the Northern Limit Line in the Yellow Sea, which basically prevents North Korean vessels and aircraft from coming to the north, to the south. If peacetime international law sets in, this is going to be this 12 nautical mile line in the Yellow Sea. So it would make it, very difficult for South Korea to defend against North Korean infiltrations. And in fact, North Korean vessels and aircraft would be able to come very close to the South Korean airspace and the South Korean coastlines. And the North Korean naval vessels would certainly be able to exercise the right of innocent passage. They would be able to, come very close to South Korean coastlines, and they will be able to go through the Jeju Strait between the southwestern tip of Korean Peninsula and the Jeju Island. And that would create or heighten the risk of tension and possible clashes. So I'm very worried about, and I'm not really pro signing of a peace agreement or declaration of peace on the Korean Peninsula. But I would like to have a discussion on different challenges that we face, and would like to hear from other specialists how we might be able to deal with these challenges. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Michi, for raising these issues and both the discussion in Japan and the challenges that you identified of a possible peace agreement. And I hope we can come back to that. We now have our fourth speaker on board, Lieutenant General Jerry Martinez. Very good to see you, sir, on the screen as well. So we'll allow General Martinez an opportunity to speak as well, of course. Jerry has a very distinguished career in the United States Air Force. His last active duty assignment was as commander of the United States Forces Japan, where he was in command of some 54,000 US service personnel and responsible for managing bilateral security issues and serving as the military focal point for negotiations with the government of Japan on a wide range of issues. But he has also served in Europe with NATO, where he, among other things, developed NATO responses to the Russian invasion in Ukraine. But now we're talking about back in 2014, I believe. Since his retirement from the Air Force, he has been involved in many different activities, ranging from serving as a podcast keynote guest with SAGE International, an Australian think tank dedicated to deepening the understanding of global strategic and political issues, working in the business world, and he has participated in a 10-episode History Channel show called Defending Japan, which highlights the security threats surrounding Japan, as well as importance of the US-Japan alliance. General Martinez is currently Vice President in Allegiant Air, based in Las Vegas. So please, it's early morning for you, but we welcome you, Jerry, on board, and the floor is yours.
Thank you, Matt. It's great to be here, and my apologies to everybody. Had a bit of a technical difficulty, but we'll Control-Alt-Delete and reboot, I'm in. So I apologize that running a little bit late getting into this. So, when I look at United Nations Command Rear, it's easy when you look at this to think it's conceptual. And what I mean by saying conceptual is that, you've heard what other people say, what its charter is, and you say, in the event of conflict on the Korean Peninsula, UNC would be involved here and here and here. And so like many of our O plans, our operational plans, things like this, it's easy to say, hey, this is a conceptual thing that UNC would participate and would do these things, but I view it very differently than that. I lived through a period when I was the commander out there in the 2016 up to the early 2019 of a very, very aggressive North Korea. In fact, the most aggressive it had been in some time. And a couple of examples is, when you look at Kim Jong-un's father and grandfather, over a 27-year period, they launched 31 missiles over 27 years. Kim Jong-un, just since 2011 coming into power, has launched, and this was data based on when I was in command, 89 launches. And let me put it in a bigger perspective. In 2016 and 17, while I was out there, he had 47 launches, which in just 2 years was more than 27 years worth of launches than his father and grandfather. So we were busy. And the way that, my mornings would work, one morning in March of 2017, all the phones light up and General Martinez, North Korea just launched 4 ballistic missiles in formation. So bear with my crude visual, but it almost looked like a fighter formation, and 4 missiles came steaming across the Sea of Japan. And this was early on in the conflict. And, our intelligence wasn't as good, and we were caught by surprise. And, everybody running and scrambling to the command centers. And then, later in August, he launched 2 more ballistic missiles that went overhead Japan. And those missiles went up north over to the Misawa Airbase region. You know, millions of Japanese citizens got texts that say missile attack, and they stopped bullet trains. People hid under their desks in schools. It caused real panic in the country of Japan, this aggressive behavior. And fortunately, those went overhead and splashed off to the east of Japan out into the ocean. And then the part that really scared me as the commander from an operational standpoint was in September of 2017, North Korea exploded an unbelievably incredible, powerful hydrogen bomb. That bomb was 7 times as powerful as the tragic bombs that were used during the World War. And the devastation that a bomb like that could cause is just unsurmountable. And it scared me that now we knew in fact that Kim Jong-un had that capability. And then the last launch that was of major significance when I was the commander was he launched a missile that went almost, I'll put it in miles if you don't mind, 2,500 miles up into space. This was unprecedented for that country. And this missile went up, straight up. My entire team scrambled to the command centers and we tracked the missile, and we have to be ready to decide, you know, is it going to be shot down? You know, what are our options? We actually got there and we had to sit for like 40 some minutes just watching. It was so high up, you know, that we were just watching and going, okay, it's going to come down in the Sea of Japan. We're fine. But it took 53 minutes from launch for that thing to get back to the ground. And the reason I tell you those stories is because what that became was President Trump at the time had publicly declared his red line with North Korea. And his North Korean red line was very simply, you are not going to get intercontinental ballistic missile capability and be able to combine that with your nuclear capability. When those two meet, you know, there is going to be some action to stop that. And I mean, the president was public about it. He was vocal about it. And we were rapidly approaching that point because of, you know, this hydrogen bomb explosion now with a missile that could stay in the air for 50 some minutes. And so what was going on behind the scenes operationally was a tremendous amount of work with UNC Rear and with forces in South Korea directly, because things looked like conflict were going to happen. It almost felt imminent as the commander. So we were doing a lot of things to be ready. And one of those was planning for a non-combatant evacuation and what that would look like. And you know, if there is conflict in Korea, that Japan is going to be a major role in this conflict, just purely because of location and agreements and things like this. And with 54,000 US forces in uniform in that country and a potential conflict just across the water, you know, those forces, many of them are going to be used. They have to be. They're the nearest in proximity to augment the approximately 28,000 forces in South Korea. So it's nothing conceptual to me. We needed UNC Rear. There was a lot of conversation happening, and we had to understand, you know, how is this going to play out? And the added twist to all of this was, as the commander US Forces Japan, I'm also was the commander or in charge of what's called safe haven operations, meaning as we're moving people out and we're trying to get citizens away and do things, you know, many of them would probably flow through Japan, and because it's safe haven. But the problem is Japan is no longer a safe haven with North Korea's capability. North Korea absolutely unequivocally has hundreds and hundreds of missiles that are capable of reaching not just Japan, but Tokyo. And so it really put a dynamic in our planning and our discussions in that, are we truly a safe haven anymore? And if we're not, then how does that change our position in working with UNC Rear, with working directly with US Forces Korea and all the appropriate agencies on managing these people coming through? So I give you that one perspective because this was real. This is not a story. It was, we lived it, and it was a very tense time for the US forces in Japan as we had to get ready for potential conflict. But the other thing that really helps US Forces Japan on any given day is UNC Rear's relationship with its sending states. So you have these sending states that are out there, that part of the contractual agreement of setting this whole thing up was that you will we use the word exercise. And exercise just means that there is going to be continuity of those sending states coming into the authorized bases in Japan that are listed, and that there will be, ships, there will be planes, there will be people that will come through. And that's part of making sure that we can operate as a force in the future with these foreign countries in Japan, with the United States forces as well. And the reason that is a really good contractual thing that they put in there is that, as I just mentioned, on any given day, there are ships and planes and people coming into Japan, which is fantastic, because what it forces my folks to do, it forced us to have to deal and integrate with them on a daily basis. And I think that's one of the greatest facilitators of protecting Japan long term, is the fact that we already have all of these countries, these sending states coming in, and the Japanese work with them. You have UNC Rear working with them, but you also have US Forces Japan working with them. And that integration, that interoperability, that commonality, all of those things, as you guys know, are crucial in wartime. You want to be able to operate, or it doesn't matter how many forces you have. So I'm very appreciative about that. And then, I'm going to get very strategic and look kind of way out here. And even though the charter was not designed for this, even though it was never the purpose of putting UNC Rear in Japan, one of the real realities that we deal with in the Pacific are the ever-changing threats in the Pacific theater. When I was the commander, Secretary Mattis, the Secretary of Defense at the time, he labeled the Pacific as the top priority AOR, area of responsibility. And that was a huge, huge statement for the United States, because we had troops in contact in the Middle East. This is real fighting going on as we speak. We have other things happening all around the world. As you know, the United States is quite busy in its foreign policy. And, we're out there in a lot of places. And yet he said that the Pacific AOR was the top AOR, or a priority that we need to worry about. And the reason is I used to tell this to people when they would come to Tokyo, and I briefed a lot of senators, congressmen, I briefed dignitaries, I briefed academics, I briefed fellow military. And, when you look at the national security strategy of the United States, our strategy basically outlines 4 countries on the entire planet that give great concern to the security of the United States. And you have Russia, China, North Korea, and Iran. Those are kind of the countries, and it's a public document, it's nothing secret, that are listed. The point I used to make to everybody is, imagine that on the entire planet, there's 4 countries that concern the United States so much, this powerful country. 3 of those 4 countries are Japan's immediate neighbors. That is a really rough neighborhood to live in. You have China, Russia, and North Korea right around you. And you can take a powerful country like the United States and go, wow, on the entire planet, 3/4 of what they worry about on any given day are parked right next to Japan. And that just tells you the strategic value of Japan. It tells you the importance, and it tells you why we have to use organizations like UNC Rear to be ready for almost anything. And so where I'm going with this is that as our competition changes in the Pacific, and we look at countries like China, who without question is the United States' #1 strategic competitor right now in the world. What would happen should conflict arise out there in that part of the world? And how would the United Nations fit in that conflict? So even though it's not in their charter, I think the interoperability that UNC Rear provided me every day, the dialogue with all of the sending states that they provided, me and everybody every day, all of those could come into value should the strategic situation shift in the Pacific. And we find ourselves not worrying so much about Kim Jong-un on any given day, but potentially worrying about, something going on. We look at the Northern Territories, or as the Russians would call it, the Kuril Islands, and you look up north, and that's a serious discussion for the country of Japan and Russia. Prime Minister Abe, one of his campaign, pledges was to do everything he could to try to free those islands back up. Well, you see by watching what's going on in the Ukraine, what Russia is willing to do. And that's got to scare you. If they've got, sophisticated military weaponry right off the north coast of Japan during certain types of situations, what action would Russia be willing to take? And then clearly, you've got China with 1,168 fighter scrambles one year when I was the commander, Japanese fighter scrambles against foreign aircraft harassing Japan. 73% of those were Chinese. And so the role of the United Nations is a never-ending role. And it's also an adaptive role. So I personally was thankful that they're there. I think they helped me tremendously operationally as a commander. And more importantly, I think they provide a strategic value that a lot of people have not really thought about as the shifting dynamics change in the Pacific of what role the United Nations might play in some future conflict. So I'll go ahead, Mats, and end it there. I hope that wasn't too long, but just some of my thoughts to kind of get things rolling.
Thank you very much, Jerry. And I think you widened the scope of our discussion a little bit, but I very much welcome that. So first, I would like to ask our four speakers if you would like to make a comment or question to anyone, each of you.
Mats.
Yes, please.
General Martinez, hey, Sir Lyle Holmes, sorry you had that difficulty getting on. I'm just going to quickly show you a slide that I presented a bit earlier, but it goes to your point, I think, and I'll take critique from you as well if you want to provide it, but just let me know if you can see that.
I've got you there, guys.
Yeah,
there you go.
I hope that goes I think it sort of sums up what you were just saying in the last piece about some of the strategic potential of UNC Rear.
Yeah, without question, that the interoperability that you provide is, it's just so invaluable. And you look, I'm a little bit bullish against China. I understand they're a strategic competitor, and we have to be kind of ready to manage that in the future. And you look at the way that conflicts are conducted today in most recent history, and most of them always involve some type of coalition. They involve a group effort. It's usually not one nation going against somebody else. It's a group of people that are working together. And as China's strength grows, you have to look at how do you, if we ever had conflict with them in the future, and they don't want it and we don't want it. So hopefully that will never happen, but you've always got to be prepared for it. What would that conflict look like? And with China's military strength growing every day, the amount of money that they're putting into their budgets, the only way that you're going to be able to manage them, and heaven forbid have to get in conflict with them and be successful, is going to be through partnerships and through alliances and through cooperation. And that's why you have organizations like the Quad that are being discussed in the Pacific. You've got trilateral and bilateral agreements in the Pacific. And I really believe, in my mind, managing that threat, and in order to get that coalition that you need, and I use that word strongly, or that interoperability, or that ability to communicate and share intelligence and do all these types of things. The UNC Rear is the glue that puts all that together for Japan. Just having that organization work with so many of the countries that you see here on the slide, and the activities that go on, I think are crucial for the long-term strategy and security and safety of the country of Japan.
Thank you very much. I would like to stay with this issue for a bit, because we've heard now that you, Jerry, laid out the let's say the strategic changes that is ongoing, and I think Professor Michi also touched upon this, that you could foresee in a more extensive role of UNC and UNC Rear in those contingency, but it was established solely as a response to the Korean conflict and the war on the Korean Peninsula. So if I ask our two Japanese participants, what do you think would that be politically acceptable in Japan to have a more extensive role of the UNC Rear? And also, if you would be able to talk a little bit the public sentiment on the UNC Rear and the activity on those 7 designated bases. So if either General Yamaguchi or Professor Michi would like to try this, please. Could you go first,
Yes.
Naburo?
Yes, and I try to do that. And public view over the defense and security wave military operations now is much better than, in a sense, better than the past. Mainly because of the nasty neighbors, as General Martinez pointed out. At the beginning, we thought North Korea, but China became obviously, and then now Russia is posing. Japanese came to aware of the fact that we are the neighbor of Russia, which just invaded Ukraine. So now the bad news is we are living in the worst situation, but good news is public support is much higher than before. And I got a question from the floor about the public sentiment and the UNC, particularly on Okinawa. The Okinawan people they have a lot of problems with bases and military activities there. But good news is Okinawan people know much more about military operation, the U.S. forces, the UN command and structure, and the legal basis for the agreement between Japan and others. So even though basically they totally opposition to the government or the U.S.-Japan alliance or even UNC position, but they know much better than the rest of the Japanese. So my point is Okinawan people, because they know they can participate in the positive practical discussion with us. So now Okinawan people are now more aware of Chinese threat, particularly those who are living in the southwestern islands. They are actually threatened by Chinese fishing boats. They are bigger, and sometimes they come with the official the Coast Guard ships. So Japanese fishermen are kind of threatened, and they feel they directly feel the sort of expansion of Chinese influence. So they are much more supportive for the defense. There used to be almost bases, except for main island Okinawa. Several new islands were hosted the newly established Japanese land forces, and the islands like Miyako, right south of Okinawa main island, or Ishigaki and Amami Oshima. Those are in between those islands, maybe 150 to 200 kilometers. Each of those islands accepted the small but meaningful unit, consisting of land-based anti-ship missile and land-based anti-air missile and infantry for security. So that is actually close to the idea of U.S. Marines are now thinking. Marine Littoral Regiment consisting of infantry and long-range firepower, and also the surface to air capability. In those areas where reinforcement of Air Force and Navy can come more easily without that sort of more easily than than the situation where we have no forward-based sort of small umbrellas. So in that context, the people are more supportive, and our posture there is much better than the past. Still, we have a long way to go, but we are now at a very good starting point.
Okay, thank you. May I turn to Professor Michi? Could you please comment about if there is any political discussion in Tokyo about this more, let's say, extensive interpretation of the role and limits of the UNC Rear, being able to use it? I think you mentioned that during your presentation that Australian Defence Forces used UNC Rear and the SOFA for humanitarian operations, but do you think it would be politically feasible also to use it for more combat operations?
Okay, actually, I'm a little more pessimistic than General Yamaguchi. The Japanese people simply don't know the United Nations Command Rear, the existence of it. And people will be surprised if they learn, probably for the first time in their lives, that the US-Japan alliance is there for the defense of South Korea, and not necessarily for certainly for the defense of Japan, but militarily, the US defense of South Korea can be actually more important than the defense of Japan per se. Finally, you know the status of Korea-Japan relationship. You know, Japanese people, if there is a conflict on the Korean Peninsula, and if they are asked to sacrifice themselves for the defense of South Korea, they will be complaining a lot. They will be basically saying, why do we have to sacrifice ourselves for the people who always say bad things about us? So that's a big problem. And so therefore, I think now good news is that the new president is coming into office in South Korea. So we have to really improve relationship between Korea and Japan. We have to slowly and steadily, without upsetting the Japanese people, we have to start educating them the reality of the strategic environment in this region and the roles, missions that the US-Japan alliance plays. And also, but in the final analysis, you know, in war, this alignment or Japanese commitment to the defense of South Korea might collapse. Therefore, deterrence is really important. We have to really strengthen and maintain the credibility of the deterrence against North Korea. Finally, a word on the US more extensive use of SOFA. Japanese people don't know, so they don't care about that. But the Japanese specialists, policymakers care about that. And they are actually, in terms of using the UNC SOFA more extensively for purposes other than Korean contingencies, they are reluctant. They are actually becoming more reluctant and more restrictive than in the past. However, they will probably be more open-minded than ever before, given what's going on in the Korean Peninsula, in other places of the world. So that they will be open-minded about making necessary arrangements so that UNC will be able to function as a point of contact for non-combatant evacuation operations or combat operations for the defense of South Korea.
Thank you very much. As I mentioned in the beginning of the webinar, I encourage you to post questions. We already have a couple of questions, so I will now start reading from the questions. The first one is from Peter Fragrell. Thank you for comprehensive briefings. Could you elaborate more about the coordination in the same time between the reinforcement task and the task of evacuation of civilians from South Korea? Maybe that goes to you, Lyle, first.
Yeah, sure, Mats. Thanks. I think very quickly I'd look to hand over to General Martinez, but I guess from a UNC Rear perspective, I think each of the previous speakers have spoken about the likely scenario of displaced people flowing from both Japan, off of the islands of Japan and off of the Korean Peninsula, probably through Japan, at the same time as international forces and US forces in particular are trying to increase their force flow in preparedness of conducting operations on the peninsula. The coordination for that is going to be very interesting. I think that there are plans in place. I think that United Nations Command and United Nations Command Rear, to a lesser extent, has some opportunity to contribute there. We, from a United Nations Command perspective, they have 22 United Nations sending states on their books, if you like, nations that contributed to the war, who could potentially contribute to that flow of people off of the peninsula and needed resources forward onto the peninsula. And of course, UNC Rear would play some role in possible coordination of that. Sir, General Martinez, I think hand over to you, be your wheelhouse.
Yeah, thank you. And yeah, I agree with you. You know, the problem with the non-combatant evacuation is that there are so many different levels and variables on how it could be done. And so there's some that the United States has been involved in the past that we see issues coming and we say, hey, methodically and slowly, we're going to move people out of an area. And we've done it with family members in some Middle East countries and some other things that have gone on. But then you can also have the extreme of what the world watched in Afghanistan, when the United States and the world was coming together to get their people out in a really quick situation while hostilities were all around them. And I think that's the variable that changes everything. If we have, you know, there's clear collision coming, there's notification coming, I think the organization and the communication between all of the agencies is absolutely very doable in a very professional way. And I think actually it will go very well. You've got a country like Japan who has great seaports and major airports that can manage millions of people going through there if we really had to do that. Now, it would certainly be difficult because just moving that amount of people anywhere in the world is not easy, but methodically and slowly it could be done. The part that concerned me is that conflict breaks out quickly. And now you've got people leaving in the middle of conflict. One, you've got problems with your commercial airliners that won't go in to get them out. And that's the thing that people have to realize. For the most part, it's not going to be, if there's a conflict, military aircraft pulling the people out, because the military aircraft are going to be used taking in all the armor, the weaponry, and all of the things that you need a military type of plane to do. So in the United States, we use what's called our Civil Reserve Air Fleet, and it's all of our commercial carriers that usually end up taking most of our troops over to different conflicts in mass. And, you know, that itself, if there's conflict, is going to change the complexity. And then it could get even worse. And the thing that I feared when we were doing the planning during the era when Kim Jong-un was shooting so many missiles and I was the commander, what I feared was what happens if one single missile gets put into Japan. You know, we're so focused on Korea that everything's about the Korean Peninsula. But I go back to Japan is no longer, in my mind, a safe haven. It's safer probably than South Korea because of distance, but it's certainly not going to necessarily be safe. And you look at a society in Japan that I would label as somewhat pacifist, and that's because of their constitution. It's what they've generations now since World War II have been raised to be, you know, not looking offensive, to not, you know, be allowed to go get into conflict and war and things like this unless it was in the defense of Japan. You know, these folks have not been around hostility. And I think the fear factor alone would be the most difficult to deal with. It wouldn't actually be the the damage that would be done to Japan if North Korea had launched missiles towards them. Japan has a very good ballistic missile defense capability. Their air defense command is fantastic. They can defend themselves. They can. And with U.S. Aegis ships and Patriot batteries and all the other things working side by side, you can defend. But what's going to be difficult to manage is the fear and the chaos amongst the civilian population. And again, I go back to, we just witnessed it, what happens when your society is scared. We watched it live in Afghanistan. It's never good.
Thank you very much.
Let me just add one thing to what General Martinez just said. Thank you very much for characterizing the Japanese citizens as pacifists. But in fact, they are not pacifists. They are isolationists. We didn't want to get involved in dirty, messy wars in the world. And we've been living in this peaceful isolation for a long time. And it would be very difficult if these people are exposed to a dire imminent threat.
Thank you. We have a few other questions. I'll like to take the next one. It's from Mick Jensen to Michichita-san. You raised an interesting point regarding the JLOC maritime border, the North Limit Line, I suppose, issues that will come with a peace treaty. Do those issues get a lot of visibility in discussions in South Korea regarding the move to a permanent peace treaty?
Yeah, I think so. The status or changing status of the Northern Limit Line is one of the most important issues when we talk about peace treaty. And South Korean people understand it, and specialists understand it. I think when President Roh Moo-hyung met with Kim Jong-il back in 2007, he talked about the NLL. And they, for some reason, these people on the kind of a progressive side, don't care about losing the NLL. I'm surprised, really. How would you be able to protect South Korea without NLL or wartime international law or legal kind of status? That would be a big challenge. And so I'm puzzled. I haven't talked to them about this, but and people understand it, but I don't think the South Korean people understand the really dire negative military implications of losing the NLL and wartime international legal status.
Again, from my experience working in the peninsula and up in the DMZ, I can just add that there is and has been a lot of tension and incidents surrounding the Northern Limit Land over the years, not least the shelling of the island and the sinking of the Chonan naval ship, but also incidents of smaller nature because of the, let's say, uncertainties about the legal status of that line, which is not recognized by North Korea. And I think it has a questionable international standing if you look to international law. So it is, as you said, it creates frictions, and maybe that's a theme for another webinar to discuss the implication of this delineation out at the LOC. There is a couple of more questions. I have another one from Mick Jansen to General Martinez. One of the challenges with the prospective non-NEO operations in the event of a Korean Peninsula conflict was trying to get across to the people the possible scale of the operation, where people, foreign embassies in Tokyo, MUFA, other Japanese civilian agencies, after the tension of 16 and 17. How confident are you that the scale of the task is front of mind to senior leadership in Japan and on the receiving end of the NEO?
Yeah, that's a fantastic question, and it sort of goes back to what was just said about the isolationism sort of mindset that goes in with the population in Japan. When we were having these discussions, and I'm going to tell you, they were very difficult to get started in Japan. It was not easy. there was real concern about when you start talking about non-combatant evacuation, that you're going to spark panic and fear in the civilian populace. And so the way our NEO planning really started during that heightened era was very, frankly, discreetly. There were, without saying, there were very senior people on both the US side and the Japanese side that were meeting and talking through all the different parameters of what we needed to do. And my background and my history, actually, I used to be one of the folks it's called U.S. Transportation Command in the United States, and that's the agency that manages planes and ships and trucks and rail and everything around the world logistically moving things. And so I was very comfortable in this environment and understood how, frankly, difficult it was going to be to conduct a NEO. But what I found was in the folks that I talked to with the Japanese government, and by the way, even my own government, so this isn't only about the Japanese, it's about the US as well, is that we said, hey, South Korea and Japan are very modern countries. They've got modern airports. People will just flow. It'll go. We don't need to worry too much. And my personal vision was, CNN and other news agencies showing tens and tens of thousands of stranded families who don't have blankets and food and all these other things that we have to figure out how we house them, because once again, one missile into Japan and commercial carriers stop flying, you could have up to 50, 100,000 people on any given day that are in your country you weren't even expecting, that were just supposed to transit, that their flights have gone through. So I think for conflicts of the future, the non-combatant evacuation has got to be a discussion point that is planned much more in advance than it was when I was the commander there. I think it's got to become part of the daily dialogue that occurs when you're doing any type of training. There's so many exercises that we do with the Japanese as partners, but I can recall none of them that I can remember of any of them that I was involved with that ever had anything to do with non-combatant evacuation to any great degree. We did do a drill with, and we had the permission of the government of Japan. We did do a test one time where we took family members and they volunteered to come from Korea, and we flew them on some planes and we practiced doing the processes of the NEO, and we actually brought them to Japan, and we had a lot of media. We had Japanese dignitaries that showed up, and then the cool part for the families was they get to stay in Japan for a couple of days and had a nice Japanese vacation. So, but it tested the concept of what that would look like, and we really did get good support from the government of Japan on that, to do that, even though but I think it was easier because that was a test versus it was planning for a potential conflict.
Thank you very much, Jerry. Time is flying, as we say, wearing Air Force uniform sometimes. But I'll give you one last round of opportunities to summarize or comment. But I also would like to leave you with one question to reflect on, and that is there an opportunity for the government of Japan to use its relationship with the United States Rear to advance its own national operational and strategic interests that is currently, let's say, underutilized? So is there and I'll start with a final comment from in order we spoke. So Lyle, over to you, please.
This may be contentious, I guess, but my bias is that all of my operational experience has been conducted with CENTCOM, Central Command, the United States and the Middle East, each of which involve very large coalitions built very quickly. The last one that I was involved with, Operation Inherent Resolve, I was the Australian Air Planner in Central Command and then Air Force Central Command. We built a 50-nation coalition within about 4 weeks to go and start conducting operations against ISIS. Coalitions matter. Coalitions are important. Coalitions are how we will fight future wars. We have a basis of a coalition from 1950 with our 22 United Nations sending states. I suspect that in any future conflict, that number will be a lot larger. We need to be ready for our current mechanisms to be able to expand and accept greater participation and what that might look like.
Okay, thank you. General Yamaguchi, please, if you have a final comment.
As to the relation with UNC or UNC Rear and the Japanese activities, UNC Rear and the UN Command Status of Force Agreement is one of the best tools for many things, various purposes. So, and I do not believe that that's so far becomes a very serious issue. Rather than that, the Japanese people tend to look at the US-Japan, the US status of force agreement, which is sometimes people say it's not fair or it's not, it's burdensome or something. But we are 100% ready to protect that too. So I do not worry about the function of both US status of force agreement and UN command status of force agreement. One comment on non-combatant evacuation. This is really serious issue, as General Martinez mentioned. We have a history problem with Okinawan people, simply because Japanese Imperial Army didn't do anything about non-combatant evacuation for Okinawans, failed, or even the military kicked out civilians from their own positions. And so after the occupation of the Okinawa began, people there hated Japanese military more than the US military. So when I was just commissioned, a friend of mine went to Okinawa, and he was having very hard time. The Okinawan people liked more US military than Japanese military. But now things are changing, but it took a long time. And this is because one of the reasons is the difficulties related to non-combatant evacuation operations. Even in 1997 guidelines, we had hard time to reach agreement on the non-combatant evacuation operation became a sort of one of the areas of bilateral agreement. US side at the beginning almost refused to talk about that. This is really serious issue for American nationals and Japanese nationals, any country's nationals. So we need to keep discussing this more forever.
Thank you very much. Over to you, Professor Michi, if you have a final comment, please.
Yes, thank you very much. Just one comment, which is not necessarily related to the UNC, but I'm seeing the growing linkage between the security on the Korean Peninsula and the security across the Taiwan Strait. The likelihood of China attacking Taiwan remains low, but it's growing. And the US-Japan alliance, the US and Japan together are committed to both the defense of South Korea and the defense of Taiwan. And so we are kind of, torn by two threats. And so we have to start thinking about how to deal with two, potentially simultaneous threats or contingencies, and how to allocate different resources to each theater. And we have to, and in case if South Korea becomes more willing to use the US ROK alliance more flexibly, and if South Korea accepts more strategic flexibility, that means more commitment to the defense of Taiwan. So we have to start talking about how the US-Japan alliance and the US ROK alliance, the US, Japan, and South Korea start sharing different roles and missions in these two areas. And more specifically, I'm concerned about North Korea's development of long-range cruise missiles and sea-based ballistic missiles. Why? Because in the past, Japan had to worry about was basically ballistic missile threat. So as long as we have a credible, robust ballistic missile defense capabilities, we could more or less, as General Martinez discussed, will be able to deal with them. But if North Korea starts to, kind of develop and deploys a large number of long-range cruise missiles capable of attacking targets in Japan, we will have to divert our precious, very important air defense capabilities away from the Taiwan Strait to the Korean Peninsula. That's one worry. And North Korea's ballistic missile submarines, they are very noisy and outdated. So they don't pose, if we decide, we will probably be able to sink them fairly easily. But the thing is, in order to do so, we have to again divert our cutting edge, very sophisticated anti-submarine warfare capabilities away from the Taiwan Strait to the Korean Peninsula. And this is really a will be cost imposed by this, because we don't have second-rate ASW assets. Everything we have is cutting edge, very expensive, very capable Seoul-class diesel submarines, US nuclear-powered attack submarines. Would we be willing to divert those cutting-edge assets for the stupid North Korean ballistic missile submarines? But we will probably have to do so because they are they carry nuclear weapons targeted at Japan and potentially targeted at Guam. So I'm getting more worried about that, and I think we have to sit. Americans, Japanese, and South Korean allies and friends have to sit together and start discussing those issues going forward.
Thank you very much. And I give the final word to you, Jerry.
Yeah, thank you, Matt. I really appreciate all the comments that the fellow speakers just said, because they're all so true. And I think mine is sort of a summary of all of those to a degree. And I think, when I look at things, I look at them from a very operational standpoint and strategic standpoint. And when you look at operationally how the environment is changing in the Pacific, the only way that you're going to be able to manage those threats long-term is to understand and accept that the environment is changing. So the way we looked in 1985 cannot be the way we look in 2022. Things have to change. Ideologies have to change to a degree. Policy has to change. The level of risk you're willing to take or not take has to change. And if there is a country anywhere on the planet that has the world changing around it, it's Japan. There's so much happening around Japan with the countries that border it, as I talked about earlier, that I think, organizations like UNC Rear are going to be crucial in the future. I think even though they may or may not have been designed for certain things, I think the strategic environment potentially could force a change in how they operate and what their responsibilities are, purely because a conflict or something happens that we weren't expecting. And then, as our speakers were also talking about, when you start throwing in a Taiwan scenario and all these other things, the only way that we're going to be successful out there is through this participation as a group, these alliances, these friendships, these partnerships, these interoperable training exercises, combining all of that with a mindset. The mindset has to change, that we cannot remain the way we were 15, 20 years ago, because China is developing so fast on such a rapid pace that if they get far enough ahead, it will be physically impossible to catch up. You've got to maintain right now, your policy changes and things like this to position Japan for success in the future. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jerry, and thank you to all of our speakers, and also a big thank you to our listeners today and for the questions you addressed to our four main speakers. I've been encouraged by all your insightfulness and comments, and I think at least have two very good ideas for two more webinars to set up about the new strategic environment and the role of Japan being squeezed in the middle, if you may say, or being a pivotal in the middle. And also this about that we addressed previously on the Northern Limit Line and its more tactical legal implications. So thank you all very, very much for this, and hope to see you soon, maybe in person next time.
Yeah.
Thank you, and have a good afternoon, good evening, or good morning. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much.
Bye-bye.
Thank you very much. Bye.